Well, welcome to our 12th and final session in our course on expository preaching. I've enjoyed walking through these topics of Scripture with you. I hope you have benefited from them, and I'm looking forward to a good final session. Just as a reminder, we have in this course really tried to do three things. The first four sessions, we tried to create a value for and an understanding of expository preaching. We tried to define it and to give you a model that you could follow in your weekly preparation. The middle four sessions were dedicated to the expository study and preaching of epistolary literature in our New Testament. This is the fourth and final session in our last major section on how to study and preach narrative literature. We've talked about the three tools of narrative literature: setting, character, and plot. And we've had a session where we've tried to introduce each of those. What we hope to do in this session is just to walk through one pericope, one story together in the Gospels. And we'll do that in such a way that hopefully at the end we can draw some observations on the setting, the characters, and the plot of this story. It's a great story, and so I hope you'll enjoy it as we go through. It's in Luke 1, and it's the story of Zacharias and Elizabeth. And we want to walk through verses 5 through 25 together. And the way we will do it is I will just introduce a series of verses and tell you what part of the plot that is. My hope is that in the future you will get comfortable being able to define those sections of plot. If you'd like right now, you may pause the videotape and try to break up this story into the 7 sections of plot. But we'll just walk through and we'll talk about the plot, and then we'll go back at the end and talk about what we're told about the setting, what we're told about the characters in these verses, and ultimately how the plot is developed. And then we'll talk a little bit about preaching this passage, all right? So let's begin. We want to begin with the prologue, and we find it in the first 2 verses of this story, of this pericope. It's in Luke 1, verses 5 and 6. Read it with me. It says, "In the days of Herod, king of Judah, there was a priest named Zacharias of the division of Abijah. And he had a wife from the daughters of Aaron, and her name was Elizabeth. They were both righteous in the sight of God, walking blamelessly in all the commandments and requirements of the Lord." And so remember, we said the prologue is a time we're often introduced to the setting and into some of the characters in the story. And here, right at the very beginning, we're introduced to both of those. Verse 5 tells us something about the setting and the background of our main characters. It says that this takes place historically in the time of Herod, the days of Herod. And so we know that this is in the early time of the gospel there in the first century. We're told he was king of Judah, and we're told that this takes place in Judah, so we know something about the physical location in which this takes place. And look how the characters are developed here. We'll say more about this later, but just notice what it says here. It talks about the families of both Zachariah and Elizabeth in verse 5. It says Zachariah was a priest of the division of Abijah. And so that Zachariah has a very significant, valuable, godly job. That Zachariah comes from a very significant, godly family. Notice what it says about his wife, Elizabeth. Even before we get her name, we're told he had a wife from the daughters of Aaron. So she is a descendant of the very family of Moses. And so she too is a significant person from the family of the Levites, from the priestly line. And this couple is married. They would have been from the best of families. That these two come from very godly families. But verse 6 doesn't just leave us with them being from godly families, because you can have bad kids from a godly family. Look what it says about these two individuals in verse 6. It says they were both righteous in the sight of God, walking blamelessly in all the commandments and requirements. And so before God, they're righteous, and before men, they walk blameless. That we see that they are from the best of families. They've got a godly job, they've got a godly heritage, and they themselves are godly. And so this prologue tells us a great deal. So we move along to the conflict that is introduced in verse 7. We see the change there with the very first word, but. It says, but they had no child because Elizabeth was barren and they were both advanced in years. And so in this verse, we're introduced into a very significant problem. They don't have a child, and they're not going to be able to for two reasons. One, Elizabeth is not able to have a child. And two, her age is such that even if it was changed now, if she was surgically able to have a baby, the time has passed. She's too old. And so they are without child and without hope. And if you were going to preach this, you would want to understand something about the cultural ramifications, the cultural setting in which this is told. This would have been a very shaming thing in a Near Eastern culture. And so we see this godly family, this godly job, this godly couple, but they have no child. So the story develops in verses 8 to 10. It says, now it happened that while he was performing his priestly service before God in the appointed order of his division. And so the priests would take turns, that different groups of priests would go to Jerusalem and serve at different times during the year. And so this was something he would have done regularly in verse 8, that it was his appointed time. He goes to Jerusalem to serve according to the custom of the priestly office. So verses 8 and 9 is just, he's going about his daily business. He's in Jerusalem serving. Verse 9b, everything changes. He was chosen by Lot to enter the temple of the Lord and burn incense. Zacharias was just doing his job. He was doing what he had done probably 100 times before. But something happened at this time. He was chosen by Lot. He received an honor that he would only receive one time in his life. That this was now the most special day of his life. He was chosen to enter the temple. In that day, one priest would go in to burn incense before the Lord, and he would take in a couple of helpers. They would help him, but only the priest would offer the incense. And he would do his work, and he would try to do it quickly, because in that day before Christ, to be in the presence of God was a terrifying thing. In fact, they would often tie a string around the leg of the high priest when he would go in on the Day of Atonement, so that if he offended God and he was struck dead, like the sons of Aaron, they would be able to pull his lifeless body out of the temple. And so he has this great honor to go in. And it says, and the whole multitude of the people were in prayer outside at the hour of incense offering. And so we see now that he's at the temple court, and we have this development that sets up a conversation between he and the angel. The turning point is fairly long. We won't read it all here, but it's in verses 11 to 20, and it takes place inside the temple, or inside while he's offering the incense. And while he's in there, he has a conversation. And we see this dialogue between he and the angel. He sees an angel in verse 11, verse 12. He's troubled and fear grips him, that he's afraid that anyone who would have an experience like this would be struck dead. Verse 13, the angel says, do not be afraid. God has heard your prayers, and you will bear a son, and you will have joy and gladness, and many will rejoice. And in verse 15, he's not just going to be a son that you rejoice in. He will be great in the sight of the Lord, that he is going to be the forerunner of Jesus, is what verse 15, 16, 17 say. In verse 18, Zechariah, knowing the truth of verse 7, that Elizabeth was first barren and also advanced in years, says, how will this happen? The days have passed, that he had prayed for this. He had probably prayed for this for years. God never answered it, and it seems that a significant time had passed that he had even given up praying for it, that he assumed God had told him no, that he continued to faithfully serve God, and yet he did it out of a place of deep and great pain. The angel answers and says, I am Gabriel, who stands in the presence of God. I've been sent to give you this good news, and as a result, you will no longer be able to speak. And so we get this turning point where the action of the story, the problem of Zacharias and Elizabeth being righteous and faithful and serving God, and yet years have passed in silence and they have no child. All that is being resolved in these 9 verses. And that leads to the consequence in verse 21 to 23. And when he goes into the temple, it says the whole multitude in 10 were in prayer. And we see here in 21, when he comes out, it says the people were waiting and they were wondering. See, a priest would have tried to get in and get out quickly. This wouldn't take very long, and he's been in there a while. And so the multitude that was there is still there, but the prayers have turned into fears and wondering. And so it says they wondered at his delay in verse 22, but when he came out, he was unable to speak, and they realized he had seen a vision. He kept making signs, and when the days of his service ended, he went back home. And so we see here in the consequence that he is now heading back to his home village. Verse 24, we see the resolution of the story that after these days, Elizabeth, his wife, became pregnant, and she kept herself in seclusion for 5 months. In the epilogue in verse 25, she said, "This is the way the Lord has dealt with me in the days when he looked with favor upon me to take away my disgrace among men." And so let's talk a little bit about the plot first, and then we'll go back and we'll talk about how we can understand who the characters were in the setting and what that will mean to preaching. But in this plot, you'll see again the parallel structure that is often true in biblical stories. And so the prologue starts that this is a good couple, a godly couple, that this is a couple that has the right family, the right birth. They were righteous, but they had no child. And we look at the resolution in verse 24, it says she became pregnant. And so we see the problem is resolved. Again, if you ever have trouble figuring out what is the problem, always look to see what gets resolved and then go find that early in the story and you'll know what the problem or the goal is. And so she has her baby. You also see the parallel structure when we look at the development of the story and the consequence. The first thing that happens in verse 8 in the development of the story is it's time for Zechariah to go from his hometown to Jerusalem. You'll notice the last thing that happens in the consequence of the story is the time for his days end at the end of verse 23, and he goes from Jerusalem to go back home. You'll notice in verses 8, 9, and 10 that he was chosen to enter the temple. And you'll notice in the consequence that he exits the temple. In the resolution, the whole multitude is standing outside and they are praying. In the resolution, the whole multitude is standing outside, but they are wondering and they are worrying. And so as the story develops, one way to determine what the author is trying to communicate is to look at these elements in the plot. What is exactly resolved or addressed? We see that in the coming and going to and from Jerusalem. We see that also in the going into the temple and the coming out of the temple. But also notice what's different, that the people are praying when he goes in, and there's a sense of joy and festivity. When he comes out, there is fear and worrying. So notice the difference there. The author's communicating something indirectly in just the way he tells that story. In the turning point, you'll notice the fear that Gabriel has. You'd want to be able to explain that to your audience, as well as Gabriel's message that he quotes Malachi 4, that he's answering the prayers that Zacharias has prayed, but not just for Zacharias. These are answered prayers that many Jewish people would have prayed, that many would have wanted the coming of the forerunner so that the Messiah might come. And so this is a great message. And also I think it's significant to point out that Zacharias had stopped praying. That a point had come where the pain had been too long, the prayers had been too many, that the age was too old, and so he had stopped praying. He continued serving, but he had stopped praying. And so do you see the structure, the flow of the story, where you have a man who is in deep pain, and yet he comes and he continues to walk and to serve a God that he doesn't fully understand. And he goes about his daily business, and God intervenes through circumstances in that to bring him into a special closeness, to announce to him the good news that God has heard his prayers, that God has met his deepest needs, and that God is doing something in his life that's going to be a blessing to him, but also to his nation and to the world. That God is doing something far more and far better than he ever could have expected or asked for. And after Zechariah exits the temple, we see the story wind down. As his service ends, he returns home, and Elizabeth gets pregnant. It's interesting to me the way Elizabeth ends the story. The only time we ever see her speak in this story is in verse 25. And she says something directly that we can only infer at the beginning. At the beginning, we're told that Zacharias and Elizabeth are from godly families, that they're of the priestly line, and that they are righteous in every way before God and before men. But they don't have a baby. As we study a little bit about that culture, we would understand that that would be a very difficult and shaming thing. They would have no one to provide for them when they get old. They would have no one to raise up a family and a name after them, which was important. And they would be thought of as having done something wrong to offend God, because God would have been expected to bless and to give offspring to those who are faithful. We see some of those things in verse 25 when she doesn't just say, I'm pregnant, I'm excited, I want this baby. Look what she says. Look how the Lord has dealt with me in the days when he looked with favor upon me. So this pregnancy, she says, God does look upon me with favor. I think she had questioned, God, what have I done wrong? God, why are you doing this? God, do you not see? God, do you not care? And in the visitation of a baby, she says, God does have favor upon me. And then she says something else, to take away my disgrace among men. I think it's interesting when it describes them in verse 6, it says that she was righteous in the sight of God, that God did look with favor upon her, but she didn't know that. It's in the giving of the baby in verse 25 that she says, he does look with favor upon me. And she and Zacharias had both been blameless in their walks before men. But here she says that God has taken away my disgrace among men. She had truly been a righteous woman, but there had always been doubts. There had always been questions because she did not receive the blessings that righteous women were expected to receive. And now she says, truly, I do know that God sees me as favorably. And I do know that men will now not look upon me with disgrace, even though I've been righteous. And so we see several things in this story. I think the setting tells us the time frame, and it's important to understand the historical setting, that this is right before the birth of Jesus. It's in the time of Herod. To understand the geographical setting, to understand a little bit about Jerusalem and the temple, to know how a priest would go in, why they would go in, and what that honor was with incense. But I think here, understanding the cultural setting is critical. And I think verse 6 and verse 25 give us insight into that, to know what it meant not to have a baby in that culture. It was a shaming, embarrassing, fearful thing because there was no safety net, no protection for her. To understand that setting would be critical to properly exegeting this story. And then also to look at the characters. Really, there's 4 characters in the story. We have Zacharias. Think about what we're told about him, that he's a priest. We're told what he does. We're told about his family. We're told that he is from one of the key families of the priests of the Levitical line. We're told that he's righteous before God and men. And we're told that this righteous man continues to serve. Those things we're told directly. Indirectly, through his behavior, we see that he continues to serve. That there's never any hint in the story that he grows bitter and he says, you know what, I'm not going to Jerusalem this time. Let other guys do that. I'm frustrated or I'm hurt with what God's doing. And so we see him continuing to be faithful. That's an indirect way that he's characterized. And then with his own words, we see him doubt Angel Gabriel. Again, remember, that's an indirect characterization, and so we have to make some judgments about that. I understand that Zechariah was hurt deeply that he didn't have a child, and that he had prayed long and hard and often for a baby, and he felt God had told him no, and he had grown discouraged and did not believe that God was going to act in this way. And so we see this man, this faithful man, this good man who's carried pain and carried shame with him as he's lived faithfully with his wife and before his God as he served as a priest. Elizabeth, we see that she is from the line of Aaron, that she is probably more significant, her family's more significant than even Zacharias's. We're not told very much about her throughout the story. We're told she's righteous before God and before men in verse 6. And then we get this statement in verse 25. And I think in her own words, we can say that she wrestled with, was she good enough? What did God think of her? Was God favorable towards her? Would God care enough for her to act and take away her pain? And I think also verse 25 tells us about how she viewed herself in relation to other people, that there was shame that she had carried for years. And so knowing those characters and being able to develop those characters helps us tell the story. The other two characters in the story are the angel Gabriel and then the multitude that was outside, really agents who kind of move the story along. I've never preached this story. But if I were to preach this story, the main idea to me centers around this idea of God visiting and caring for His people, even when it doesn't seem like it. That God knew where Zacharias and Elizabeth were. That God heard Zacharias and Elizabeth's prayer. That God in verse 6 viewed them as righteous, and verse 25 acted in favor. I would build my sermon around that idea, that though we may not hear Him, though we may not see Him, though we may not understand, we can always trust that God is good, that God is aware of where we are, and He knows what we're going through. I often used to teach, my wife and I often used to teach our boys every night before bed a couple of things about God. We would read a Bible story, we'd talk about the Bible, and then we would always tell them that God is powerful, He's watchful, and He's good. That God has the power to take care of any circumstance we face. That God is watchful, that He knows any circumstance we are in. And He's good, that we can trust that what He does, regardless of our circumstances, is what should be done. 5 years ago, my wife went through cancer, and I can remember days and nights, oftentimes at 3 a.m., laying in bed awake, thinking, God, I would not treat my children the way You are treating us. This story is one of the stories that would come to mind. That these men and women, Zacharias and Elizabeth, they were faithful, they were godly, and they walked in pain for years with seeming no answer. But God was good and God was with them. And I think that's a message that needs to be preached regularly in our churches. And I think this passage is a beautiful story to paint that picture. And so as you tell this story, you'd want to have an image that might open up with something that maybe it's directly related to this, where it's a story of someone who's gone through suffering for a long period of time. I might use something that's not directly related, where somebody's gone through things they don't understand only to have it work out in the end. I would try to think of some examples of situations, whether it's life situations or a book or something that would talk about somebody who just kept being faithful, even though they didn't know why, and it all came together in the end. And talk about that oftentimes that's where we are in life, that we see things from an earthly perspective, and we don't know how it is all going to fit together, and that we're not the only ones that have ever felt that. And I would say today in our story in Luke 1, we're going to see a couple. They were the best couple. They were from the best family. They had the best job, godly family, godly life. and yet they carried deep pain. And you know what? God knew where they were, and God was faithful when He didn't give the child, and God was faithful when He did, that He made it right. And I would move to a point of application where I would encourage those in the congregation who are suffering to know that God knows right where they are, and God will meet them at their points of deepest need. I want to end this course really the way we began, emphasizing the utter importance and privilege you and I have as the mouthpieces of God in our generation. That God has given to you a group of people that you speak in a community to a congregation, and you have the opportunity to speak the very words of God to the souls of men and women. The work we do is an eternal work. And so I want to leave you just with 2 verses out of 1 Corinthians 4. These are verses I always try to remember as I minister. Paul, describing himself, could have said, I'm Paul the apostle, I'm Paul the writer of the Bible. Listen to what Paul says. He says, let men regard us, and he's talking to others in ministry. He says, let people regard us in ministry in this way, that we are servants of Christ, that you and I are nothing more than servants. The thing that gives us value is not us, but it's who we serve, that we are servants of Christ. And what we do in our service is the most important service. That you and I are stewards of the mysteries of God. That you and I are the ones who are entrusted with the very words of God, the mysteries of God, that we get to speak them to people in our generation. It goes on to say in verse 2, in this case, it is required of a steward one thing, that he be found faithful. And so my prayer for this course, my prayer for you, my prayer for me, is that we would be found faithful, especially in this area of studying and preaching and communicating the Word of God to God's people. Thank you for taking the time to go through this study. Thank you for the time we've spent together. And I pray that your ministry and your preaching would be forever impacted for the glory of God.